Back in the day when we had computers like this, we had video game systems like this, the Atari 7800 ProSystem. The Atari 7800 ProSystem, as it was called, was developed in 1983 and intended for a 1984 release. However, the video game market was very poor back then, and it was decided to hold back the release of the Atari 7800 until a major rollout in 1986 after the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Sadly, it was too late, and the Atari 7800 ProSystem failed to reach the kind of sales numbers that the previous Atari 2600 success had achieved. These are the switches for making it easier or harder. You just don't see those anymore. I think the Atari 7800 is actually quite a remarkable game system, because not only does it play Atari 7800 games, but it also plays Atari 2600 games, and this makes it backwards compatible if you take both systems into account. The big question, of course, is how does the Atari 7800 compare to the PlayStation 3? Here at Classic Game Room headquarters in our laboratory setting, we have the two machines head-to-head, and you can see the enormous size difference the PlayStation 3 has over the Atari 7800. The PlayStation 3 weighs much more than the Atari 7800, primarily because the PlayStation 3 has its power supply inside the unit, whereas the Atari 7800 comes with an external power supply that you plug into the wall and then plug the cord into the Atari 7800. Similar to what the Xbox 360 uses, except on a much smaller scale. Sadly, there weren't that many titles released specifically for the Atari 7800. Only about a couple dozen, really. But the good thing is it does play Atari 2600 games, and that makes it a good investment. The real strength with the Atari 7800 lies in its catalog of fantastic arcade games like Galaga, Dig Dug, and Joust. And that's one thing that everybody agrees the 7800 did very well. The other great advantage to the Atari 7800 was the ability to play its enormous library of Atari 2600 games. And there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of them. This is an Atari 7800 video game cartridge, and this is Xevious. I'm not a huge fan of the black on silver, but I'm sure this was a cost-saving measure by Atari since the game market was not doing very well in 1984 to 1986, especially for them, when they were getting their ass handed to them by the NES. But in order to put the game into the Atari 7800, you simply just shove it into the slot, and it's ready to play. Similar to the PlayStation 3, the Atari 7800 comes with a controller. However, this is the controller that we got over here in the United States. And what separates this from the 2600 is, most notably, two buttons. One on either side here. And this is arguably the worst video game controller ever made, because in serious gaming, there's no way to hold on to this thing. It just rolls around in your hand. And even if you use your thumb, it's still slipping around. It does come with a nice chrome finish that says Atari on it, so it looks cool, but it really sucks. This is horrible. Horrible, 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 awful controller. For those of you fortunate enough to get an Atari 7800 in Europe or Australia, England, this is the controller you got. The Atari 7800 two-button controller gamepad, which is very similar to a Nintendo Entertainment System controller. And this is actually pretty good. This has nice little depressions here for your thumb to rest in. It says Atari. Had a little thing you could screw in here to make it more like a joystick. But overall, if you can find one in the United States, this is definitely the way to go. Almost. You can also play the majority of Atari 7800 and 2600 games on a Sega Genesis controller, because for whatever reason, it has the exact same plug as an Atari 2600 and 7800 plug. And this is, without a doubt, one of the best video game controllers ever made. fact, this controller and the PlayStation controller are my favorites. Sega. You can also play games with the Atari driving controller, like Indy 500 for the Atari 2600. The paddle controllers will work, so you can play Breakout, Super Breakout, and Night Driver on the Atari 7800. Those are games for the 2600. Can't get one of these for the PlayStation 3. And my personal favorite, the keyboard controller. Pretty exciting. Now we must ask the question, what is the better video game console? The PlayStation 3 or the Atari 7800? Keep in mind here on Classic Game Room that we like the classic video games just as much as the newest ones on the PlayStation 3. And when you look at the Atari 7800, you need to look at it as we saw this in 1986. One thing that the Atari and the PlayStation 3 share in common is they both had lackluster releases. The Atari 7800 was released in 1986, and by that time the Nintendo Entertainment System was dominating the market, and sales of the Atari 7800 were far below expectations. The big difference is that the PlayStation 3 has a long life ahead of it. Because the game market is much bigger now, it's a phenomenal game system. It has a great selection of titles that's improving rapidly at the moment, has some good games like Resistance, Fall of Man, and Warhawk, Gran Turismo 5, and Grand Theft Auto 4. And the PS3 has so much potential and will be a tremendous game system for years to come. The Atari 7800 did not last long, and you didn't hear much about it since the NES was dominating the market in the mid to late 80s. It's a collector's system, and it's a game system to own if you love the classic arcade games like Donkey Kong and Xevious. It's also the system to own if you like Atari 2600 games because it gives you the most variety of games that you can play. This Atari 7800 is about 22 or 23 years old and has worked flawlessly that entire time. It's never broken down once and does exactly what it is supposed to do every time you put a game cartridge in it and play video games. The PlayStation 3 is a brand new video game system. Now, I've never had a problem with it. So far it does exactly what it's supposed to do, and it does it very well. The question is, will the PlayStation 3 still be working 22 years from now? Therefore, I declare this review pitting the PlayStation 3 versus the Atari 7800 as a draw. They're both excellent video game systems, and they both do what they're supposed to do. Now, one's a bit older than the other one, so we do have to revisit this in 22 years. But the PlayStation 3 is an amazing game system if you want to play the newest games on the market like Warhawk and Grand Theft Auto 4. The Atari 7800 is a great game system if you like to play Atari games and classics like Galaga and Donkey Kong. You really can't go wrong with either one. In fact, ideally, you should own them both, because real gamers can kick ass at both Galaga and Resistance Fall of Man. PlayStation 3 and 7800, keeping it real together.